Today, we are wrestling with a conflict that really, it defined a generation, it scarred a continent, and it just fundamentally altered America's relationship with war and trust. I'm talking, of course, about the Vietnam War.
It's a conflict that our sources just paint with this profound sense of paradox.
Yeah, that's the word for it, paradox. It's described, and this is so tragic, as a war that began in good faith by good people with good intentions,
But then it completely devolved. It became, as one source puts it, one of America's darkest pages.
And if we really want to get to the heart of it, that paradox is the central tragedy, isn't it?
It is. The war became so dark because I think the American political establishment fundamentally misunderstood what they were even fighting. For Washington, it was all about these abstract Cold War ideologies. It was about stopping the spread of communism.
It's the Domino Theory.
The Domino Theory, exactly. Yeah. But for the Vietnamese people, and this is, I think, the most essential insight from our sources, this was never a war about communism. I mean, not primarily.
So what was it about for them?
It was, first and foremost, a grueling, multi-generational war for national independence.
And that complete divergence of narratives. I mean, that just sets the stage for a catastrophe.
An absolute catastrophe.
Yeah.
And it's so important to establish the sheer scale of that tragedy right from the top. The human cost is just staggering.
It is. And we, in the West, we often just focus on the American side, right? Over 58,000 Americans died. A horrific number.
A terrible number. But when you zoom out, when you factor in the Asian costs, the numbers become truly overwhelming. 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died.
250,000.
Over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas. And then and this is the one that always gets me, over 2 million civilians.
2 million.
Across both the North and the South. And that number, that civilian number, is a horrific indictment of the policy failures. 2 million civilians tells you right away this was not a military problem that could be solved with force. It was a deep, deep political and historical misunderstanding. So our mission today is to follow that precise chronological path through this, incredibly complex event. We're going to focus on those core decisions, the domestic politics, and the really surprising turning points that reveal why this war just unfolded into the political quagmire it became.
And we had to start long before the first U.S. helicopter even landed.
Way before.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's rewind the tape all the way back to the foundation of the conflict, 1858.
Right.
So when we talk about the history of Vietnam, we really have to start with this nearly century-long shadow of French colonialism. It begins with the conquest of Indochina in 1858. And the French they were the classic imperialists of the age, weren't they?
Absolutely. They called their project mission Civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. It sounds so grand.
The civilizing mission. But what did that actually mean on the ground?
Well, it meant taking raw materials, dominating trade, and imposing their culture and their language. They did build roads, sure. They built bridges. Our sources note that. But at the same time, they were systematically destroying local systems of governance, of education.
And what's so fascinating here, what our sources really emphasize, is that the Vietnamese response was just consistent across centuries.
That's the key. They did not take well to the French colonizers, just as they hadn't tolerated earlier invasions by the Chinese dynasties for, 1,000 years.
So for the Vietnamese people, this struggle for independence had these incredibly deep, continuous historical roots.
Precisely. The French were simply the newest foreign enemy, and this nationalist drive, this fire, would later prove to be far more potent than any political ideology, including communism.
Which brings us to 1919, a moment that, in hindsight, it just feels like one of the great missed opportunities in global history. Yeah. This is potentially the point where the U.S. lost its chance to really support the side of independence, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Yes, 1919, the Paris Peace Conference. It's the end of the Great War, World War I. And you have the American president, Woodrow Wilson, who is there championing this idea of independence and self-determination for colonized nations. It's all part of his famous 14 points.
And into this moment walks a young man with a petition.
A young Vietnamese nationalist.
Yeah.
The petition is signed by him and other nationalists, and it's a simple request. They're asking the French to grant them an independent state based on Wilson's own ideals.
And that man, of course, was Ho Chi Minh. Our sources really stress his adaptability. The man went by some 70 different names throughout his career before he finally settled on Ho Chi Minh, which means he who enlightens.
And he wasn't some isolated figure. He had spent time in Western capitals, London, New York, even Paris itself. He was absorbing revolutionary ideas, Western political thought. He wasn't a rigid ideologue at this point. He was a pure nationalist just seeking recognition for his people.
So what happened? He presents the petition.
And the outcome was just devastatingly anticlimactic. Ho Chi Minh's petition never reached Wilson. The president's secretary promised to show it to him, but there is zero evidence he ever did.
So the great champion of self-determination just completely ignored the plea of the Vietnamese people.
Completely. And that rejection, that snub, it proved to be absolutely pivotal. Ho Chi had already fled Vietnam back in 1911 after a demonstration against French taxes. He'd been in exile for years. And this moment in Paris just confirmed his deepest suspicions.
Which were?
That the West, for all its talk of freedom, would never willingly grant freedom to colonized peoples.
And that's what pushed him. That's what led to his major ideological shift.
That's the moment. He stays in exile and he just immerses himself in the anti-colonial writings of Lenin. He starts to realize if the West won't help, he needs a different framework. He needs different allies. And that's where he becomes a dedicated communist.
But again, and our sources really demand we stress this nuance, communism was the tool. It was the organizational structure, the vehicle, the external ally that promised to help him achieve his one true goal.
Which never changed.
Which never changed. A truly independent Vietnam. His primary fuel was always nationalism.
Always. And the ultimate twist in this whole story comes with the start of World War II. By 1940, France is conquered by Nazi Germany, so Japan moves in and occupies Vietnam.
And Ho Chi Minh seizes the opportunity.
He returns to Vietnam after 30 years in exile and founds the Vietnam Independence League. And he starts relying on classic guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run strategies, blending into the civilian population. You know the drill.
And then in the spring of 1945, the war creates this ultimate irony. A brief, really surprising U.S. alliance.
It's incredible, isn't it? The U.S. government is looking for ways to undermine the Japanese forces in the region, and they are contacted by Ho Chi Minh, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which are the direct precursors to the CIA.
The OSS, yeah.
They supply Ho and his fighters with weapons, medical kits, training. They start working together.
And our sources describe the OSS agents as being genuinely impressed by the Viet Minh, their tactical proficiency, their dedication.
They really were. In fact, Ho Chi Minh, for a time, began to call his followers the Viet American Army. He was publicly praising the United States as a champion of democracy, an ally in the fight against fascism. They were fully functioning partners, aligned in their anti-Japanese goals.
And this partnership sets the stage for this incredibly dramatic declaration of independence. After the atomic bombs are dropped, the Japanese surrender is imminent, and Ho Chi Minh calls on the Vietnamese people to rise up before the French can rush back in and reestablish colonial rule.
He's racing against the clock.
Totally. So September 2nd, 1945, this is the very day Japan officially surrenders to the Allies. Hundreds of thousands of people gather in Hanoi, and Ho Chi Minh proclaims Vietnam independent.
And he stands before the crowd and echoes the American Declaration of Independence. He even quotes the line, "All men are created equal." It's this moment of incredible hope.
The future looked so promising for an independent nationalist Vietnam. But there was a fundamental obstacle. The one man in power who had actually favored self-governing states had just died.
President Franklin Roosevelt.
FDR was gone. His successor, Harry Truman, inherits the global stage, and that stage is rapidly being consumed by the rise of the Soviet Union.
The whole game changed. The geopolitical calculus shifted dramatically, and the purely nationalist fight for Vietnamese independence was about to be tragically subsumed by the great ideological struggle of the 20th century.
And that shift in global priority is what allows the French to successfully lobby for U.S. support and make their colonial move once again.
Absolutely. Once the Soviet Union became the primary global threat, Truman's focus immediately shifted from supporting post-colonial independence to this new policy of containment.
Right.
His attention was on stopping Soviet expansion in places like Eastern Europe, Turkey, Greece, Iran, and this vacuum of attention elsewhere gave the French incredible leverage.
And the French basically played the single most effective card they could in that era.
The Soviet card.
The Soviet card. They warned the U.S. that if their colonies like Vietnam became independent under American pressure, the French government itself might be destabilized and fall prey to local communist influence or radical leftist parties within France.
And given the precarious state of Western Europe after the war, that was a threat Truman absolutely could not ignore. He couldn't risk losing France.
So the result was immediate and, for the Vietnamese people, just heartbreaking.
Completely. The U.S. had to choose its Cold War ally, France, a key NATO member, over its World War II partner, Ho Chi Minh, who was now labeled a communist, even though he was a nationalist first.
So the U.S. started supplying massive amounts of aid. At one point, our sources say it covered 80% of the French war costs, and the French just poured thousands of men back into Vietnam.
America had officially prioritized its alliance in Europe over the principle of self-determination in Asia.
And this fear, this anti-communist fear, it really solidified into concrete policy in 1950 when communist North Korea invaded South Korea. The U.S. intervened successfully and pushed them back, which seemed to demonstrate that communism in Asia could in fact be contained through military might.
And that success cemented the political philosophy that would define the next 2 decades.
The Domino Theory.
The Domino Theory. The idea was deceptively simple. If one nation, like Vietnam, fell to communism, then all the neighboring nations, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, they would all inevitably follow suit, like a row of falling dominoes.
And this psychological doctrine, it just became the unquestioned dogma dictating nearly every U.S. policy decision moving forward.
It completely erased the original context of the Vietnamese struggle. It framed every single bullet fired not as a fight for independence, but as a direct assault on Western democracy.
But before the U.S. could fully replace France as the primary Western power in the region, the French had to be decisively defeated, and that happened spectacularly at Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
Oh yeah. By 1953, the French had been fighting for 7 years. They'd suffered over 100,000 casualties from the Viet Minh's relentless guerrilla tactics, ambushes, sabotage, the slow, grinding erosion of French morale.
But the Viet Minh, they were supplied by the Soviets and the Chinese. They weren't just formidable fighters, they were brilliant logisticians.
They were, and the French, they were demoralized. They were looking for an exit, but they wanted to exit from a position of strength. So they came up with this plan for a fortified base at Dien Bien Phu, this remote valley.
And the thinking was they could draw the Viet Minh into a traditional set-piece battle where French air power and firepower would guarantee a victory.
But their strategic arrogance was just fatal. They believed they controlled the high ground. They completely dismissed the jungle-covered hills that overlooked the valley. They thought it was impossible for the Viet Minh to move heavy artillery through that kind of terrain.
And they were wrong.
So wrong. The Viet Minh did the impossible. 50,000 Vietnamese soldiers surrounded that valley. And over several months, they disassembled heavy artillery pieces, dragged them piece by piece up these steep, jungle-covered slopes, and then reassembled them in concealed positions overlooking the French base.
And they were supplied by tens of thousands of bicycle porters just operating around the clock.
It was an incredible feat of human will and logistics. So when the Viet Minh artillery finally began to fire, the French were completely trapped. Their airstrip was destroyed immediately.
And after 55 days of brutal, sustained attack, they surrendered. They lost 8,000 troops in the entire campaign.
So what does this all mean? This decisive victory, it instilled this powerful, almost spiritual belief in the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh. After a century of colonial rule, they could defeat a modern great Western power, no matter the cost or the technological disparity.
And that psychological victory was arguably the most important outcome of the battle. It informed their strategy for the next 20 years.
Absolutely. The resulting Geneva Accords brought a temporary end to the fighting in '54. They split Vietnam into 2 parts along the 17th parallel, separated by a demilitarized zone, the DMZ.
And civilians were given 300 days to relocate, either north or south.
And a lot of them did. About 900,000 refugees, mostly Catholic peasants, they fled south, seeking a life free from the communist regime.
So the north, with its capital in Hanoi, was led by Ho Chi Minh. And the Communist Party implemented these brutal land reforms, seizing property, consolidating power.
Yeah.
Very similar to what Mao was doing in China.
Yeah, and it left tens of thousands dead and imprisoned. It was not a gentle transition.
Meanwhile, the South became the Republic of Vietnam, with the capital in Saigon. It was led by President Ngo Dinh Diem, and he was protected by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN.
And crucially, the Accords called for national reunification elections to be held in 1956. But Diem, with U.S. backing, he refused to hold them.
Why?
He knew, and the U.S. knew, that Ho Chi Minh would win in a landslide. His nationalist credentials were just that strong.
So that refusal, that guaranteed the war would continue.
It guaranteed it. Forces determined to fight for a united Vietnam, the Viet Cong, formerly the National Liberation Front, or NLF, they began heading south along what would become the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail.
And the U.S. and its allies were quick to just dismiss them as communist traitors, directed from Hanoi.
Right. Ignoring the thousands of genuine Southern nationalists who were also joining the insurgency because they couldn't stand Diem.
And that's the thing. The U.S. investment in Diem was so deeply flawed. The promised democracy in the South, it just quickly became a corrupt, oppressive dictatorship.
He was a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist nation, and he showed extreme favoritism to Catholic officials while actively suppressing the Buddhist majority.
And that oppression became unbearable, really peaking in 1963. It provoked one of the most famous and shocking acts of protest ever recorded on film.
The self-immolation. A 73-year-old Buddhist monk, Thich Quang Duc, he drove to a busy Saigon intersection, calmly sat down in the lotus position, and set himself on fire using gasoline.
And the power of that image was its silence. The crowd watched him burn to death without intervening. He became a potent martyr.
Other monks followed his example, and these images flashed across global newspapers and television screens. They exposed the brutality and the instability of the regime the U.S. was backing.
And Diem's reaction wasn't reform. It was more oppression.
More oppression. He imposed martial law, arrested anyone who protested, including students. And the U.S. leadership, now under Kennedy, they realized they couldn't win a war with such a reviled ally. He had become a liability.
Exactly. So Diem's reign had to end. South Vietnam's military generals, knowing the U.S. would not intervene to stop them, and this was a deliberate, tacit non-interference from Washington.
All right, they gave him the green light without saying green light.
They assassinated Diem and his brother in November of 1963. Our sources note that people were literally celebrating in the streets of Saigon.
But this created a massive political vacuum, which is exactly what President Kennedy had dreaded. The U.S. had removed the figurehead, but they had no stale replacement. Who was going to govern the South now?
And then, just 3 weeks later, Kennedy himself was assassinated, leaving this unstable, chaotic mess of Vietnam to his successor,
Lyndon B. Johnson.
By 1961, John F. Kennedy was facing a whole series of significant Cold War setbacks. The Soviets had launched Sputnik, they'd built the Berlin Wall, and communist movements were spreading in Laos and Cambodia.
The pressure on him was immense. Critics in Congress and the Pentagon were demanding aggressive action. He absolutely could not afford to be seen as soft on communism, especially after the Bay of Pigs disaster.
So his advisors, they were urging him to send ground troops immediately. They kept repeating the Domino Theory mantra.
But Kennedy, maybe remembering the French experience and the advice of people like General MacArthur, he refused. He refused to commit full combat units. He still believed that the war needed to be fought by the South Vietnamese themselves.
So he chose a middle ground that, while it avoided a full commitment, it deepened the U.S. involvement exponentially.
Right. He sent in elite groups like the Green Berets. He significantly increased the number of military advisors, in quotes, from a few hundred to over 16,000.
And he doubled military funding, poured in sophisticated military hardware like helicopters and armored personnel carriers.
But the escalation wasn't just quantitative, it was morally transformative. Kennedy authorized the use of napalm,
that highly flammable petroleum jelly,
and chemical defoliants, most infamously Agent Orange. The stated purpose was to deny cover to the Viet Cong and destroy the crops that fed them.
The use of these chemical weapons, it signals how hardened the U.S. commitment had already become. The willingness to engage in that level of authorized destruction, destroying the environment, the food supply, it shows that the U.S. saw the war as existential even before they committed large numbers of their own troops.
And then, November 1963, Kennedy is assassinated, and Lyndon B. Johnson takes charge. And LBJ inherits a catastrophic situation.
The Viet Cong, they saw the instability caused by Diem's assassination in this political vacuum, and they just intensified their attacks all throughout the countryside.
And Saigon was in absolute chaos. I mean, between January 64 and June 65, the South saw 8 different governments try to seize control and then collapse.
8 governments in 18 months.
It was just coup after coup. The government was in ruins. And that instability was so profound that it convinced many in Washington that the only way to save the South was through direct, massive military intervention.
And that direct intervention was basically manufactured by the critical event of the war, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August 1964.
The facts around this incident are so key. The USS Maddox was conducting electronic surveillance off the coast of North Vietnam. After it issued warning shots, it came under fire from a North Vietnamese torpedo squadron.
But our sources actually indicate that Ho Chi Minh was surprised by this action. He immediately disciplined the impulsive officer who had given the order to attack. It suggests this was not a planned provocation from the top.
No. But back in Washington, the Joint Chiefs were baying for blood. They urged immediate retaliation. Johnson, to his credit, initially refused. He demanded evidence of a second attack to justify a massive response and to prove North Vietnamese aggression.
And this is where the political manipulation becomes just shockingly clear.
There was no second attack.
It never happened.
Never happened. Instead, under heavy pressure, sonar operators in poor weather convinced themselves they had detected torpedo fire. They called it a probable attack.
Probable, but not certain.
Not certain at all. Johnson was told it was probable. He later remarked privately that they were probably shooting at whales, but he used that unverified, probable, non-existent second attack to send American pilots to bomb North Vietnamese torpedo boat installations and oil facilities for the very first time.
And the crucial legal justification came right after. Johnson went to Congress, claimed the U.S. had been repeatedly attacked in international waters, and that non-existent second attack was the pretext that allowed Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and it passed overwhelmingly.
This resolution is so historically significant because it granted the president sweeping authority without a formal declaration of war to deploy U.S. forces and assist any threatened Southeast Asian country.
It was a blank check.
It was a blank check for war. It gave the executive branch the power to manage and escalate the conflict at will, based entirely on uncertain and, frankly, manipulated information. It was an unprecedented abdication of congressional war powers.
So, with that blank check secured, the escalation just happened rapidly.
Yeah.
Viet Cong guerrillas shelled the American air base near Saigon, killed 5 Americans. Then they struck a helicopter base at Pleiku, killed 8 advisors.
And Johnson, who was just driven by this deep-seated fear of looking weak, he responded massively. He hoped to shock North Vietnam into surrender.
On March 2nd, 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder began.
Right. Johnson started systematically bombarding targets in North Vietnam, and the policy shifted entirely from purely retaliatory bombing to an all-out attack designed to cripple the North's infrastructure and break their will.
And this huge policy widening, moving the U.S. from advising to actively attacking the North, was deliberately kept secret from the American public.
It was. And our sources revealed the stark, uncomfortable truth behind the final decision to commit ground troops, which Johnson did later that month, in March 1965. The Viet Cong attacks continued, but America couldn't leave. They were just too heavily invested, financially, politically, prestigiously.
The Pentagon Papers later explicitly revealed the true motive for putting ground troops in Vietnam. And it wasn't fundamentally about fighting communism,
Which they knew was a secondary threat compared to nationalism.
it was to avoid humiliation.
To avoid humiliation. The fear wasn't losing Vietnam. The fear was the domestic political fallout of being the administration that retreated. The war was officially escalated to save face.
By 1966, you have 200,000 U.S. troops stationed in South Vietnam. But the death tolls are just climbing rapidly. And despite this massive American buildup in firepower, the Viet Cong now controlled 3/4 of the South Vietnamese countryside.
It was a war defined by the enemy's incredible resilience and the U.S. inability to cut off their supply lines.
And that resilience centered entirely on the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Which wasn't a single road, right? It was this intricate, sprawling logistics network, 12,000 miles of twisted jungle roadways, footpaths, bridges, tunnels, all snaking through officially neutral Laos and Cambodia.
So the U.S. reasoned that if they could just damage the trail enough, the enemy would starve or run out of ammunition.
And they tried. Oh, they tried. The intensity of the aerial warfare aimed at this supply line was just astronomical. The U.S. dropped 3 million tons of explosives on the Laos portion of the trail alone.
And to give you some context for that number, that is 1 million tons more than were dropped on both Germany and Japan combined during all of World War II.
Just on that one section of the trail, yet the trail survived. And the question is why? Because the logistics were completely decentralized and low-tech. Supplies were moved by tens of thousands of porters, mostly women, carrying loads on their backs or transporting them with these reinforced bicycle brigades. If one section of the trail was bombed, they immediately moved around it. They hid supplies in caves, decentralized storage depots. This low-cost, high-resilience system proved completely impervious to the high-tech U.S. Air Force.
It was a total mismatch of scale and technology. And for the American soldier on the ground, the impossible terrain itself became the enemy.
Oh, absolutely. They were trained for open European fields, not this. They had to move through elephant grass that would cut their skin, thick thorn bushes, bamboo groves 20 meters tall, and jungles so dense it could take an hour just to move 100 feet.
And the environmental hazards were just relentless. Black leeches that cause quick, painful infections, torrential monsoons, oppressive heat, and a ground just laced with tripwires, booby traps, landmines.
The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. They were hidden in these massive underground tunnel systems. They were disguised as civilians. They only initiated contact when they had a decisive advantage.
And to make matters so much worse, the standard-issue U.S. weaponry often failed the men. Soldiers were deployed with M16 rifles that were initially unreliable, and they would frequently jam during intense gunfights.
Our sources note this tragic irony. American soldiers were fighting the most difficult terrain in the world, with weapons they couldn't trust, and it often cost them their lives during crucial engagements.
So the tactical dilemma for the U.S. commanders, especially General Westmoreland, was just agonizing.
It was, because American troops won nearly every major conventional engagement. But their victory rarely mattered. The strategy was search and destroy and body count.
So the U.S. would clear an area, declare victory based on the number of enemy dead, and then they'd leave to go clear another area.
And the moment the U.S. troops left, the Viet Cong would simply walk back in and retake the land. Enemy soldiers were quickly replaced via the Ho Chi Minh Trail and local recruitment. So it created this grinding, unwinnable war of attrition where the military success was completely disconnected from any strategic goal.
And this failure, it fed into the terrible numbers game back home.
The body counts.
The public was constantly being told about a 10-to-1 kill ratio. America was winning. The military leadership was measuring success purely by the number of enemy dead, and they were often pressuring junior officers to falsify body counts, to inflate those ratios, and meet political goals.
But the reality was simple, wasn't it? American families, they didn't care about the 10 enemy soldiers they killed. They only cared about the one, their son, their husband, their daughter. And that disconnect between the metrics of victory in Washington and the reality of loss at home was the core of the trust crisis.
And General Westmoreland, he's still clinging to this belief that he can achieve victory through sheer scale. He requests 200,000 more men.
But internal dissent was boiling over. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, one of the war's chief architects, had started to realize the futility of the whole campaign. He told President Johnson directly that the chances of victory were no better than 1 in 3, and probably worse.
And this is the cynical heart of the political tragedy. Johnson's decision was to send the men anyway. He deployed hundreds of thousands of American troops to a war that those inside Washington, the defense secretary himself, already knew was a lost cause.
All to avoid the political humiliation of withdrawal. And so by the end of 1967, 20,000 Americans were dead, yet U.S. leaders were still insisting victory was in sight, famously claiming there was light at the end of the tunnel.
And that political lie brings us directly to January 1968 and the Tet Offensive, the moment that just fractured American public trust forever.
The North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong, they planned this massive, coordinated general offensive. They targeted 36 of 44 provincial capitals, dozens of military bases, and major cities like Saigon and Hue. And it was time for the Tet Lunar New Year truce, when everyone's guard was down.
So on January 30th, 84,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers attacked all at once. They targeted the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, provincial governor compounds, key military infrastructure. For the first time, U.S. soldiers could see their enemy clearly. They were fighting house to house, in the streets, in public buildings, not hidden in the jungle.
And tactically, it was a devastating defeat for the communists. They were eventually pushed back after weeks of brutal fighting. They suffered an estimated 58,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Johnson and Westmoreland rightfully claimed it was an overwhelming military victory for the U.S. and the ARVN.
It was an overwhelming political defeat for the U.S. government.
Absolutely. Vietnam was the first true television war. The public had been told relentlessly that the enemy was ground down, disorganized, on the verge of collapse.
So when the Tet Offensive launched, in every major city, playing out on television screens across America, it directly, visually contradicted everything the government had been claiming for years.
The famous quote from the news anchor Walter Cronkite declaring that the war was unwinnable, it just reflected the national realization. Public trust in the government evaporated overnight. The sheer scoop of the attack demonstrated that the enemy was stronger, better organized, and far more determined than Washington had ever admitted.
And the fallout was immediate. Johnson's political career was shattered. On March 31st, 1968, he stunned the nation. He announced a unilateral halt to the bombing of North Vietnam to initiate peace talks, and he announced that he would not seek re-election.
And the national trauma just amplified from there. It pushed the nation into this profound division, the deepest since the Civil War. Just months later, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Then Robert Kennedy, who was campaigning specifically on a platform of ending the war, was also assassinated in June. The war, the political upheaval, the violence, it had utterly destabilized the United States.
So against this backdrop of division, violence, and tragedy, Richard Nixon is elected president in November 1968, and he runs on a platform of peace with honor, promising to end the war. By the time he takes office, 37,000 U.S. troops have died.
And here we encounter one of the most shocking and secretive betrayals of the entire conflict, Nixon's secret treason.
What do you mean by that?
Well, as the election approached, Johnson had actually made significant progress toward peace. Hanoi had agreed to talk, and critically, the Viet Cong were to be included in the negotiations. Peace was genuinely within reach.
But then, just 3 days before the U.S. election, President Thieu of South Vietnam unexpectedly withdraws from the peace talks. He claims the deal is flawed. Why the sudden reversal?
Our sources confirm that a representative of the Nixon campaign, a woman named Anna Chennault, had secretly contacted the Saigon government. And the message was crystal clear. Stay away from the Paris peace talks.
And the promise was?
The promise was that once Nixon was elected, he would drive a harder bargain with Hanoi and guarantee a better outcome for Thieu than the deal being offered by Hubert Humphrey's Democratic administration.
So Johnson found out about this.
Johnson discovered the extent of this conspiracy through CIA bugging and FBI wiretaps. Nixon and his team were essentially committing an act of treason, contacting a foreign power in the middle of a war to actively sabotage peace talks for political gain.
But Johnson, unwilling to reveal the massive scale of the intelligence operations he was running on U.S. politicians and foreign leaders, he kept silent about the crime.
So Nixon was willing to delay peace, prolong the bloodshed, and sacrifice American lives just to get elected. And the result was years of further stalemate, leading directly to more pointless and desperate battles like Hamburger Hill in May of 1969.
Hamburger Hill is the perfect microcosm of the war's strategic failure, isn't it? Men were sent into these vicious, pointless battles where they died for land they were told to immediately give up once the objective was secured.
Our sources are absolutely blunt about this. Once Vietnam became a political war driven by face saving, body count is all that mattered. They fought for a statistic, not for territory.
And the political pressure was immense, fueled by massive anti-war protests back home. So Nixon had to be seen as ending the war, even while he was secretly widening it by bombing Cambodia and Laos. And he introduces his new policy, Vietnamization.
Vietnamization. The plan was to gradually train and equip ARVN troops to take on the responsibility of fighting the Norse, which would allow U.S. troops to withdraw slowly. And the U.S. did. They poured resources into the ARVN. Over 1 million M16 rifles, 40,000 grenade launchers, thousands of vehicles.
But the irony, the fatal flaw, was known by everyone involved. American officials, South Vietnamese officials, they all knew it.
They knew. If the world's most powerful military couldn't win the war with 500,000 of its own troops, South Vietnam stood absolutely no chance alone. Vietnamization was, in reality, a political cover designed to allow the U.S. to retreat without looking weak.
And as U.S. casualty figures started to fall because of the troop withdrawals, the anti-war sentiment back home reached new heights, but for a different reason.
Moral clarity.
Yeah. The public learned about the My Lai Massacre in late 1969. They learned that American soldiers had intentionally slaughtered more than 500 innocent men, women, and children in a village they suspected of harboring Viet Cong.
And the details of My Lai just horrified the world. It shattered the American self-image as the moral protector of democracy. It brought America's own morality into profound question.
And this, combined with the violent suppression of protests, 4 students killed by National Guard troops at Kent State, 2 students killed at Jackson State University, it meant the moral crisis back home was peaking. The anti-war movement was transforming into an anti-government movement.
So with negotiations stalled in Paris, Nixon, ever the political tactician, showed his brutal resolve again. He initiated the infamous Christmas bombing campaign in late 1972, a massive, concentrated aerial assault all around Hanoi.
The bombing killed 1,600 civilians. It drew international condemnation.
But the result was swift. After only 6 days, Hanoi agreed to return to negotiations. America had effectively bombed them into accepting a deal that primarily secured the release of American POWs and the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops.
It was an end to American involvement, but it certainly wasn't the peace with honor Nixon had promised.
Not at all. So on March 29, 1973, the last American combat troops left. Only 200 Marines remained to guard the embassy. The South and the North were left to fight on, guaranteed to descend once again into a brutal civil war. The U.S. had secured its own withdrawal, leaving the ARVN to face the North Vietnamese army alone.
And here's the final, ultimate nail in the coffin for the South. Nixon had secretly pledged massive U.S. air support if Saigon were ever in dire trouble.
But in August 1974, Nixon resigned amid the Watergate scandal. He lost all his leverage, and Congress, weary, angry, and deeply distrustful of the executive branch, cut South Vietnam's military funds and assistance in half.
That reduction immediately triggered the ARVN collapse. The U.S. was sending guns, but not enough bullets, planes, but no pilots or fuel for training, trucks, but no spare parts. The South Vietnamese military just rapidly disintegrated, with up to 20,000 ARVN troops deserting every month.
The North pushed south in 1975, defeating the ARVN forces at every turn, seizing territory easily. On April 29, 1975, the invasion of Saigon began, and the frantic evacuation of the U.S. Embassy staff and their South Vietnamese allies. It became a global symbol of American failure.
The evacuation was chaotic, brutal, humiliating, helicopters ferrying people from the embassy rooftop to aircraft carriers stationed offshore. And to make room for the continuous flow of evacuees, ships were pushing fully loaded helicopters right into the ocean.
And the desperation of those left behind climbing walls, begging for a spot on the final flights, it was just indelible.
The South surrendered on April 30th, 1975, to prevent further bloodshed. And the immediate aftermath was harsh. Many South Vietnamese officials and soldiers were sent to these so-called re-education camps for up to 10 years. And ARVN graveyards were systematically bulldozed to physically wipe away the memory of the South Vietnamese regime.
The political failure was complete. Everything the U.S. had fought for, died for, and destabilized an entire region to prevent a unified communist Vietnam had now happened.
So Vietnam was finally united after 30 years of continuous war. But with extensive Soviet help, the country was immediately forced into this rigid, strict socialist system.
Right. This meant the immediate collectivization of agriculture, the abolition of private capitalism in the South, and the nationalization of nearly all industry.
And the results were just swift economic catastrophe. The rigid communist planning, it just didn't work for the agrarian economy. The standard of living fell drastically. Vast numbers of people starved because of resource mismanagement and a total lack of infrastructure.
So this new unified Vietnam did not deliver the prosperity or the stability that its revolutionary leaders had promised.
And this failure, it led to a massive refugee crisis, the infamous boat people.
Our sources estimate that 1.5 million people eventually fled, taking these desperate sea journeys across Southeast Asia. About 400,000 of them eventually made it to America. The war's trauma and the failure of the political system, it clearly extended far past the 1975 surrender.
So what does this all mean then, looking back at this long trajectory of tragic decisions? As John Kerry, a decorated Vietnam veteran who became an anti-war activist, later testified, the war brought everything into question. It forced a moral accounting of American actions, tactics, and political motivations.
Yeah, the conflict exposed these core, deeply uncomfortable ethical questions for the American public. We had to grapple with the rationalization of destroying entire villages in order to save them from communism.
Or the meaning of free fire zones where soldiers were authorized to shoot anything that moved, regardless of who or what it was. And of course, the sheer scope of America's morality in the face of the My Lai Massacre.
It also exposed the political manipulation of the war itself, especially for the soldiers on the ground. They had to accept the cheapness placed on the lives of civilians, the constant political pressure to falsify body counts, and the ultimate unimportance of battles.
That's a good way to put it, the unimportance of battles.
The image we are left with, the final synthesis, is one of systemic political failure. Men charged up hills like Hamburger Hill, only to be told to march away and leave the land for the enemy. Battles were blown into these extravaganzas, and the war was prolonged because America couldn't lose and she couldn't retreat, regardless of the lives lost.
So the ultimate conclusion is stark, isn't it? It was never primarily a soldier's war. Yeah. It was, fundamentally, a political war, driven by pride and the fear of embarrassment.
That's right. But we must close by acknowledging the bravery and the sacrifice of those who fought and died on all sides. They risked their lives for what they believed was their country, and the profound, overarching political and ethical failures of Washington should never, ever erase those personal costs endured by the men and women who served.
So we have completed our deep dive, tracing the Vietnam War's trajectory from really a pure fight for Vietnamese independence, that was tragically transformed into a Cold War proxy conflict.
A conflict driven primarily by imperialist fears and political humiliation, ending in economic ruin and profound moral complexity.
We've seen a war that was prolonged and widened, not by military necessity or any achievable strategy, but by political necessity. The absolute fear of looking weak or admitting a mistake. The key decisions, from Truman ignoring Ho Chi Minh to Johnson exploiting the Gulf of Tonkin and finally Nixon sabotaging peace talks, they all reveal this consistent, tragic pattern of prioritizing political face-saving over American and Vietnamese lives, and over the truth.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. We've established pretty clearly how strategic policy can be overridden by domestic politics and the fear of humiliation. So when you look at modern international conflicts today, how can we discern the difference between military strategy designed to achieve a genuine, definable victory and political strategy designed merely to avoid looking weak on the global stage?
And considering the changing definition of the war, from independence to containment and back to civil war, is there ever a clear moral victor when the definition of the conflict itself shifts so drastically over time, allowing politicians to continually redefine the goals to suit their domestic needs? Something to ponder as you process the lessons of this tragic history.